Hello, friends. Welcome to the It's a Guitar YouTube channel. As you can see by the title, today's topic is vintage and why you should not buy vintage. And I strongly believe that. And you're going, Tanner, that's crazy. I know your channel. I follow you. Look at behind you, tons of vintage stuff. I know. Vintage is not, it's not for the faint of heart. It's not for the people, for the vast majority of people. Let's just put it that way. And I'm going to go into why and go through the three main categories of vintage gear. That would be, in my opinion, speakers, guitars, and amplifiers. Those are kind of the three main food groups, so to speak, of vintage items people purchase. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on each of those, but just high level, right off the rip in this video, I strongly believe that the vast majority of people should not purchase vintage. It is frankly not worth the headache. It is so much more expensive most of the time. So many things can go wrong. It's a treacherous game, buying vintage. And I can speak firsthand. And I know many of my friends and many of you guys watching probably can as well. Now, obviously, I love vintage gear. I'm very romantic about it. And I just love the history side of it. And I love taking this old stuff and keeping it going and reusing it and using it today and kind of how it was intended so long ago. I love all that stuff so much. But buying vintage is tough. Really, what it kind of comes down to is inexperience leads to extremely expensive mistakes. That's the big kind of thing with vintage. It's all about how much you know and how much do you really know. I like to think I know a lot about vintage gear. I own a lot of it. I've played a lot of it. You guys have seen on the channel. We've had everything from 1959 Les Pauls to 64 ES345s, all sorts of very cool guitars. I have lots of friends with cool gear. I've been to many guitar shows. I obsess about researching this stuff online. Even still, I don't know nearly enough to really reliably purchase most vintage gear, because even little things that are not quite right, or maybe somebody touched it up and you didn't catch that, those could have huge monumental effects on the value of the item. So that's the first real thing with vintage gear. Don't buy it, because if you don't know tons and tons, you're not an expert in the field, you're gonna have problems. And I know you're going right now, Tanner, well, that's what dealers are for. So let's cover that real quick. There's really two types of sellers of vintage gear. You have the private party seller, who typically doesn't really know what they have. Therefore, they can't really accurately describe the item and its condition. So you're left, the burden is on you to really dive into it, fine tooth comb the photos, try and do what you can in person and make a judgment call, essentially. So that's one side of it. And obviously, there's a lot of allure with those items, because they're typically lower priced, than what you see from dealers because of that. But man, it's so risky. It's so risky. And I've documented many, such cases on this channel where I purchased things from private parties and ended up having problems. My 100-watt Marshall, probably can't just see it just over my shoulder here. I purchased that from the original owner. He said it worked. I showed up, we flicked it on, did not work. I mean, there you go. And we didn't know what the problem was, and I had to roll the dice with that. And thankfully, I ended up being able to fix it, and it wasn't a catastrophic mistake, but definitely could have been very bad. So that's one side. The other side is the dealers. Now, this might be a hot take, but I think vintage dealers today are pretty untrustworthy. I see listings constantly from all of the big names where the descriptions are, on one hand, you have very minimal descriptions because almost intentional. That's what it comes across. They're, the less they say, the less they can be held accountable to. So there's one side of that. The other side is, I think, the talent of, inspecting vintage stuff. I think it's taken a step back. Carter's, for example, used to be a place that everybody would trust with vintage gear. Most people I know today that are actively buying vintage gear don't really trust Carter's, for example. The descriptions were inaccurate and just some egregious examples. And there's other places too that it's been similar kind of feelings. I don't know what happened with Carter's. They changed ownership or something, but just an example that comes to mind that I've heard of people talking about that are buyers of the big stuff. And this is across so many other dealers. And the other thing is, dealers are trying to move items, obviously. And you say, well, Tanner, you can just return it, right? With the dealer, it's one of the advantages. Well, most places have a very small window when you can return the gear. A couple days is not unusual. That's not, in my opinion, anywhere near enough time to actually accurately review the item you purchased, be it a guitar or an amp, and completely feel confident in the, in the status of it, the originality of it. You've got your rose colored glasses on. You just got this new item you spent a ton of money on, presumably. It's going to take a bit more time than that. And what are you going to do? You could be stuck with something because you didn't catch that the bridge, your ABR bridge, your ABR1 on an original 50s Gibson happens to not be original, happens to be a repro that somebody aged, and you didn't catch it. Well, guess what? One of those costs thousands of dollars to purchase an original one. That's going to bring the value of the item you purchased way down. So again, there's going to be lots of nuance to this, but in general, I think those are kind of some of the elements of why I think it's a bad idea to buy vintage. And I really don't recommend it. So let's get into some more specifics here. Let's start with speakers. Speakers, goodness gracious, guys. I have purchased a ton of vintage speakers in the past year and a half. Everything from several sets of vintage Alnico silvers and blues from Celestion from the 60s, vintage Jensen speakers, specifically C10Ns. If you know anything about that speaker, very sought after, very rare. And I've purchased 3 of those in the past year. G12H30, blackbacks, greenbacks. I purchased the gamut, kind of a lot of the well-known vintage speakers, because it's just a rabbit hole I got down into. A lot of my amps came with these vintage speakers still intact. They sound fantastic. They sound different. And I wanted to chase that a little bit. And I did. And guys, let me tell you, every single instance of a vintage speaker I purchased was a complete and utter disaster and failure, except for one. I'm batting like 10% success rate. It's just unbelievable how treacherous the vintage speaker world is. And I don't recommend it at all. Ignorance is bliss, guys. Ignore it. The modern stuff is fine. Your ear will get used to it. It'll break in. It'll sound great. Don't get into the vintage speaker stuff. It's so bad. I had speakers, of course, the sellers will claim that they're working perfectly fine. That's the hard part about vintage speakers, and speakers in general, used speakers. Visually, they can look perfect, but they could just, again, look completely perfect physically, but the only way to really tell if a speaker is functioning correctly is to play it and play it at volume, which is hard to do and hard to demonstrate when you're selling and when you're buying. So speakers arriving with coil rub, damage from shipping, and then sellers tend to claim, oh, it worked perfectly beforehand. You ruined it. I literally got screwed on a deal with the guy who, claimed I broke the speaker, just all sorts of stuff. It's so hard to prove otherwise. It's just a mess. Vintage speakers are a mess. Let me show you, I got here a quick prop of just an example of that. So if you know anything about vintage 10-inch Jensens, you'll see this and go, ooh, that's pretty nice. Although the badge on it is not the Fender one. This is a C10N. This is one of the most sought after 10-inch speakers ever. They're super rare. They came in things like my 65 Vibrolux reverb, for example, Princeton reverbs as well. And they just have according to the internet, incredible sound, the best sounding 10-inch speaker. People much prefer these, according to the internet, over the Oxfords, for example. So I wanted to purchase a pair to put in my Vibrolux reverb to compare to the Oxfords in it. That amp sounds fantastic. I've demoed it on the channel. Tons of people rave about that amplifier. I want to know, is the grass greener or not, right? So this is my craziness. So I purchased 3 of these. And this one, I purchased a very clean pair. You can see how clean the cone is. Basket is completely collapsed on itself. The magnet is not level. This thing got completely destroyed in shipping. The guy that shipped it had no idea how to ship speakers. And these unobtainium C10Ns pair completely destroyed, ruined. Paperweight. That's all. They're not good for anything. That happens all the time. I had vintage Alnico silvers that got damaged, and nobody's doing repairs on them anymore, really. A recone completely ruins the value of the speaker. It's basically, you got a brand new cone in a vintage metal, metal case. It doesn't really mean anything. They don't have any value really anymore. The sound is in the cone. It's just a mess, guys. It's a mess. Vintage speakers, It's just not worth it. It's not worth it. I don't recommend it one bit. If you have to buy vintage speakers, you really, really want to try those, buy a cabinet or buy an amplifier with them. Don't buy individual speakers. That way you make sure it's a working package, and you don't have to worry about issues of shipping speakers on their own as well. They tend to do better in the cabinet. So if you have to buy vintage speakers, don't buy them alone. But in general, I don't recommend it. Don't do it. So that's that. Let's move on to guitars real quick. Let me go grab my guitar. So this is my only vintage guitar I currently own. See if I can get the headstock for you guys there. So as you can hopefully see in the silk screen, it says Les Paul. Obviously, this is not a Les Paul, but it was a Les Paul at the time. So this is a 63, an early 1963 Les Paul Jr., and it's had modifications done to it where they added in a 1972 T-top here, embossed logo, very rare pickup, super cool. They carved out the pickguard here to put selector switch, just really cool. It's got patent pending Grofers on it. It's just an awesome, awesome guitar. I love vintage guitars. They've got so much character and soul to them. It's hard not to love them. That being said, I don't think you should buy vintage guitars unless you got a ton of money, a ton of money, and you are really willing to take the time to learn and build up your knowledge of vintage guitars and befriend a lot of people, a lot of owners before you make the jump, because there is no bigger chance of failure than with vintage guitars with the pricing of everything nowadays. Vintage guitars, anything half decent is, minimum $10,000 plus. I mean, these things used to be worth nothing. Obviously, this one's been modified. Pretend it didn't. It's all original. These things, used to be a couple grand, $3,000 maybe. I think they're now, maybe not 5 figures, but getting pretty close to it, which is absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. Is it a cool guitar? Yes. If you're a player, it doesn't make sense to buy vintage in general, in my opinion. They tend to not play as well as modern guitars. They, tend to have problems. They tend to need things like refrets. Vintage Fenders usually need to have the pickups rewound because the pickups often fail. And I have a friend, James at Rewind Electric. He did a whole video talking about how every vintage Fender pickup, is going to fail. Just the way they were made, they're all destined to fail and have to be rewound. That's going to be something that you're going to have to worry about if you have vintage Fenders and they haven't had that issue yet. Gibsons tend to fare better just because of the way they were made. But there's just so many problems that can come about. And the other thing with vintage guitars is every little component has a huge effect on the value. If you don't know all of the little intricacies, all the little tells to ensure the finish is original, for example, there's a huge delta in pricing and value of vintage guitars based on the finish. From standard cherry finishes like this to the custom color Fender stuff, it just gets massive. And you could lose tens of thousands of dollars if you think something is an original finish and it happens to be a refin. Man, it is so dangerous, so dangerous. So again, if you're not an absolute expert and have friends that are absolute experts that can help you, have additional unbiased opinions and connections with, dealers, I just don't think it makes sense. At the pricing of everything nowadays, I don't think it makes sense. And I think in general, vintage gear is just being traded back and forth between other vintage owners of similar level gear. So, high-end, 50s Gibson owners are buying and selling from other high-end 50s Gibson owners. I don't think there's a ton of new people coming to the market. Certainly not people, in my age necessarily. There's going to be exceptions, of course, but I think in general, that's probably the case. And it just becomes so expensive and there's so much room for things to go wrong. I don't think it makes sense. Again, this is I love vintage guitars. I've played many of them. Do they sound infinitely better than reissue guitars? No. I've played many vintage guitars that don't sound that great. They tend to be very imbalanced in my experience. They tend to, for example, have a great bridge pickup, but the neck's not that great. It's just there's so much variance with vintage guitars. I don't know. Would I own a vintage guitar? Would I want to buy more? Yes. But again, I'm crazy. I'm the exception, not the rule. I really, really genuinely believe that. I think most of you watching are also that way. There's going to be some of you that are, maybe really disagree with what I'm saying here. You're probably the exception too. Most people are, can barely afford reissues in the first place. High-end reissues are so expensive, they're getting near the 5 figures. But I just struggle to see where it makes sense unless you're just a collector and you've got a ton of money to play with and you can risk having things go very wrong. So that's vintage guitars. Now let's move on to vintage amps. All right, so vintage amps, obviously that's something I have the most experience with. I've owned a ton of vintage amps. I got a bunch behind me. I've worked on a ton of vintage amps. I taught myself how to be an amp tech, as new followers of the channel might not know. So I can speak a lot to this from the firsthand experience. Vintage amps are just landmines. Frankly, I do not recommend vintage amps for the vast majority of people. Do I think they have tons of value? Yes. Again, I'm very romantic about the vintage gear. I think there's something so cool about the old amps. I do think they can sound very different. And I do think a lot of that comes down to the speaker, not even necessarily the amp itself. But either way, there's so many poorly listed amps for sale. And if you're not an expert on looking at circuits of vintage Fenders, vintage Gibsons, vintage Voxes, Marshalls, etc., and being able to pick out every little thing of, hey, this resistor, this is wrong, somebody messed with this doesn't look right, man, you could really go under on a amp pretty quickly, especially the pricing of everything nowadays. Everything's priced so high, there's not a ton of margin, and little changes can have a huge effect on the value. The obvious stuff to talk about would be the transformers, for example. If you don't know how to read transformer codes, don't look at vintage amps. Just walk away. It shouldn't even be on your radar. That is skill number one to learn, because if you have if the output transformer has been replaced with something that is not a vintage equivalent of what it should have been originally, you're talking about significant cuts to the value. Does it affect the tone significantly? I don't know how many people have taken an original output transformer and put in a Mercury magnetics and side by side. I've never seen it done. Maybe somebody's done it. I don't know, but the internet here says it has a huge effect. Therefore, the value is dramatically changed if you have the transformers swapped. Power transformer, much less important in my opinion. 300 volts is 300 volts. I always say that doesn't matter where it's coming from. So power transformer doesn't really matter, but it will have some effect on value, but performance-wise, no. So there's things like that. Lots of little nuance. Reading pot codes, for example. Knowing about the blue molded caps in vintage Fenders and how important those are. Knowing the Astrons, yellow Astrons, and the fact that if those are present in the amp, you're going to have to get those replaced, and that's going to be pretty expensive. There's just so many of those things. And, I've gotten screwed on this a little bit. I'll speak to my first-hand experience, and I'll speak to a customer's experience. So this amp over my shoulder here, this is a 53 Gibson GA40. I wanted one of those forever. I went to a guitar show here in Southern California, and I purchased it. I did a whole video of me going to the guitar show, purchasing it, taking it home, and doing some work on it. The amp is giving me nothing but problems. I purchased it from a vintage dealer there at the guitar show. It was recently serviced by a famous amp tech, and it has given me nothing but problems. It is not healthy. It's not been healthy since I've had it. And I'm an amp tech. I'm not a professional, quote unquote, amp tech where this is the only thing I do, but I've done a ton of amps. I've worked on a ton of amps, and even I got screwed by this. I, trusted this dealer, and I trusted who had worked on it before, and we found problems, missing solder joints, and the amp is just still not healthy, which is a bummer because it's such a cool amp. It's just been sitting there because I haven't had time to work on it. There's my little story. That's, again, somebody that has a lot of experience with this. Then I think of another customer that brought a vintage Bassman to me, 6G6 Bassman. He traded in a boutique modern amp it was a Benson or something, and he got this old 6G6 blonde head Bassman. This amp was just brutalized. I mean, everything was wrong with it. We ended up having to replace both the power transformer and the output transformer. I had to redo the entire circuit. This thing was just destroyed. And this poor guy, he had no idea. He didn't open up the chassis and look inside. How many of you guys outside of the amp tech people can open up a chassis and be able to look at that and go and point out everything that's been changed or is wrong about it? Almost nobody. So as a general consumer, you watching this, it's not advisable for you to buy vintage because you could get screwed. And this guy got screwed. He ended up having to pay for me to do a ton of work to this thing. It ended up sounding great, but he absolutely lost in that trade 100%. He got taken by a store. And that gets to my next point. You cannot trust stores with vintage amps. I don't care how big they are. Notice if you go to the big vintage guitar dealer stores that they never show inside circuit photos of the amps. Ever. Almost never. Why is that? It's absolutely crazy. They're hoping you're ignorant. They're wanting, the best case scenario for a dealer is that you are ignorant to all of those nuanced details of the inside of a circuit, because that just causes more problems. Most vintage amp buyers see it's a vintage Fender, vintage Gibson, great, and they have no idea anything about the inside of the amp, and it's missing the key components that really makes it sound the way it does. And so now it's not even going to sound like it should. You have no idea. So you can't trust vintage dealers. The only amp I've ever purchased from a vintage dealer is the AC10 SRT. I did a whole video on that as well. And that dealer misrepresented that amp, claimed they freshly recapped it and biased it and all of that. We found out that was not the case. And it took a lot of back and forth with them to get them to acknowledge that was untrue. They basically lied. And B, to give me some money back, very small amount, to cover the work needed to make it right. And that's one of the biggest dealers, around, one of the biggest vintage dealers around. So my recommendation, if you have to buy vintage amps, you really are dead set, I need to own a vintage amp. You need to befriend a local tech, and you need to pay them to look over the amp before you buy it, just like you would a car. That's what you have to do, because they're going to have the experience to be able to look at the circuit and hopefully also be able to know all of the date code things and speaker date codes and how to read all of that so that they can tell you if this is original, what is, what isn't. But you need to befriend somebody that is an expert in it. Give them some money for their time and for their experience, and have them okay a purchase beforehand, because otherwise it's just not worth it. It's not smart. If you're in the middle of nowhere and you got no amp tech friends or no one to go to that you trust, I would avoid it. Modern amps sound great. They can sound fantastic. There's so many great options out on the market. It's not worth it unless you're crazy like me and you got to have the vintage thing. And what did I do? I couldn't trust anybody, so I taught myself all this stuff. I did tons and tons of research. I had some fails. I taught myself how to work on the amps so I could fix them up. And here I am. And that's great, but it's not a recommended path for most people. And you can lose a lot of money. So I think that just about covers it. Just talking off the cuff here a little bit, guys, but I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think. Are you, a big vintage proponent, or are you somebody that's like, why even bother with vintage stuff? Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think in the comments. And until next time, see ya.